Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're taking a look at a set of ancient laws, the Ten Commandments, but probably not in the way you're used to. We're going to explore the idea that they're not just a list of religious rules, but maybe, just maybe, they're a kind of blueprint, an operating system for a healthy life. So let's just start with this paradox that I think a lot of us are feeling. We have more freedom, more technology, more ways to connect than ever before in human history. And yet, there's this undercurrent of anxiety, of loneliness. Why is it that with all this progress, so many of us feel, well, kind of lost? To try and find an answer, we're going to turn to a pretty wild idea. The argument we're looking at today suggests that maybe in our rush to embrace everything new, we've tossed out some ancient wisdom that we desperately need, that some of our most modern problems might actually have very, very old solutions. And this brings us to something called the Lindy effect. It's a really cool concept. Basically, it says that for stuff that doesn't rot, like ideas, the longer it's been around, the longer it's likely to stick around. Time acts like this incredible filter, weeding out bad ideas. And there are very few ideas that have survived as long as the Ten Commandments. So here's the big radical question for today. What if we've been looking at these laws all wrong? What if they aren't just arbitrary rules handed down from on high, but are actually a map of our own minds, a description of psychological reality that we've kind of forgotten how to read? So what does that even mean in practice? Well, it shifts the focus from blind obedience to something more like alignment. The idea is that these laws aren't just a list of thou shalt nots. Think of them more like guardrails on a dangerous mountain road. They're there to keep us, both as individuals and as a society, from flying off the cliff. And that perspective, it completely flips the script. It moves the conversation away from this fear of some external punishment and towards an internal logic. So the logic isn't, don't do this or you'll get hit by a lightning bolt. It's more like, hey, you probably shouldn't do this because history shows it reliably leads to things falling apart, both for you and for everyone around you. And when you look at them this way, you start to see how each commandment actually targets a critical weak spot in human nature. Together, they create this kind of psychological architecture. They're dealing with the big stuff, right? How we find meaning, how we build and destroy trust, how we manage desire, all the fundamental challenges every single society has to figure out if it wants to survive. Which brings us to the central analogy we're using today, a cognitive operating system. The OS on your phone or computer just runs in the background. It manages all these incredibly complex processes to keep the whole thing from crashing. Well, the argument is that these laws work the same way for society. You can ignore them for a while, but eventually the system gets unstable and starts to crash. Okay, to make this less abstract, let's do a deep dive. We're going to zoom in on just one of these laws, and we're picking one that sounds, frankly, a little obscure and old-fashioned. But as you'll see, it is shockingly relevant to our world right now. It's the one about not taking God's name in vain. Now, I know what you're thinking. That just means don't swear, right? But that's barely scratching the surface. This is actually a really profound principle about the sacred link between our words and our reality. So here's the modern translation that really unlocks this. The original Hebrew for in vain means something like empty or false. So to take a name in vain means to use these big, foundational, world-building words like truth, love, promise, even sustainability, and to make them hollow. It's about letting a gap grow between the world you describe and the world that's actually real. And believe me, this is not some abstract philosophical problem. We are living in the middle of a full-blown epidemic of this. We're surrounded by the rubble of worlds that were built on empty words. Let me show you what I mean. Take Elizabeth Holmes. She was an incredible storyteller. She used the language of revolution, of changing the world, of healing people. She spoke a vision into existence, a vision that people were desperate to believe in. And they did believe. Her words, her promises, they created a reality that investors valued at $9 billion. She literally conjured an empire out of thin air, just with language. But there was one tiny problem. It was all a lie. The technology never worked. Her words were completely empty. And when that gap between promise and reality was finally exposed, that entire $9 billion world didn't just fail. It vanished. It evaporated. And in the process, it poisoned the well of trust for so many people. And we see this exact same pattern in politics, right? A leader uses a powerful word like ironclad to make a solemn promise to voters. They're building a reality with that word. But when the promise is broken, it doesn't just hurt their reputation. No, it's worse than that. It damages the very idea of a political promise for everyone. The word itself starts to feel empty. Or how about the corporate world? Volkswagen took a powerful, almost sacred modern idea, sustainability, clean diesel, and used it as a mask to hide a massive lie. They used the language of virtue completely in vain, and by doing that, they made it just a little bit harder for all of us to trust any company that talks about being green. So, what's the big deal? What's the real cost of all these hollow words? Well, it goes way beyond just making us all a bit more cynical. There are real, tangible consequences when we start breaking that link between language and reality. Neuroscience actually has a term for this feeling. It's called a social prediction error. It's that negative jolt your brain gets when someone's actions don't match their words. It's the feeling of betrayal. And what it does is it literally shuts down the parts of our brain that are responsible for cooperation and trust, and it fires up our threat detection systems. We go into self-protection mode. You can see how this leads to a downward spiral. It's like a chain reaction. First, words become unmoored from reality. Then, trust is violated on a massive scale. And when you lose trust, social cohesion, the very glue that holds us together, just dissolves. And what you're left with is what we see so much of today, a cynical, polarized society, where we can't even agree on basic facts, let alone tackle big problems together. So what's the antidote to all this? Well, according to this line of thinking, it's a return to a very old virtue, integrity. The word itself comes from the Latin integer, which means whole or complete. A person of integrity is someone whose words and actions are aligned. They're whole. What they say and what they do is all one piece. Their promises aren't hollow, their speech is not in vain. And that leaves us with a final question to think about. In a world that so often seems to reward empty promises, hype, and manipulative language, what is the real cost of choosing to speak and act with integrity? And maybe more importantly, what is the ultimate cost of not choosing it?